The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges, translated by Anthony Boucher, narrated by Mike Vendetti. On page 252 of Liddell Hart's History of the World War, you may read that an offensive of 13 British divisions supported by 1,400 pieces of artillery planned against the Sierra Montblanc line for July 24, 1916, was postponed until the morning of the 29th. The torrential rains, Captain Liddell Hart adds in a note, were responsible for this delay, an insignificant one in any case. The following statement, dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Tsun, former professor of English in the Hachil at Tsingtao, casts an unsuspected light over the entire affair. The first 2 pages of the statement are missing, and I hung up the receiver. As soon as I had done so, I recognized the voice which had answered in German. It was that of Captain Richard Madden. The presence of Madden in Victor Rodenberg's flat meant the end of our projects, and, though this seemed, or should have seemed, of secondary importance to me, likewise the end of our lives. It meant that Rodenberg had been arrested or murdered. Footnote: a hypothesis at once repulsive and ridiculous. The Russian spy Hans Reibner, alias Victor Rodenberg, used his automatic to attack Captain Richard Madden, who carried a warrant for his arrest. In self-defense, Madden was obliged to inflict the wounds which resulted in the spy's death. End footnote. Before that day's sun should set, I would incur the same fate. Madden was relentless, or rather, circumstances compelled him to be relentless. An Irishman in the English service, a man accused of apathy and perhaps of treason, could hardly fail to seize gratefully upon this miraculous chance to uncover, capture, and possibly kill 2 agents of the German Reich. I went up to my room. Absurdly, I locked the door and threw myself down on the narrow iron cot. Through the window I saw the roofs I had always seen, and the clouded sun of 6 o'clock. It seemed incredible that this day, so like all others, should be the day of my inevitable death. No premonitions, no symbols. My father was long dead. It was long ago that I was a child in the symmetrical garden of Haifeng. But was I to die? And now? Then I reflected that all things happen to a man in the precise instant of now. Centuries pile upon centuries, and only in the now can things happen. Men innumerable fill the sea, the earth, the air, and all that really happens to me. The almost intolerable memory of Madden's horse-like face cut short these wanderings. In the midst of my hatred and terror, the terror no longer signifies. Now that I have made a fool of Richard Madden, now that my throat longs for the noose, I remembered that this tumultuous and doubtless happy warrior had no suspicion that I possessed a secret. The name of the precise location of the new British artillery station on the Immerse. A bird streaked across the gray sky, and blindly I translated it into an airplane, and this airplane into many that streaked through the French sky and annihilated the artillery station with vertical bombs. If my mouth, before the bullet destroyed it, could cry the name of that location so loudly that it might be heard in Germany. My human voice was weak. How could it reach the ear of the chief? The ear of the sickly, hateful man who knew nothing of Rodenberg and me, save that we were in Staffordshire, and that he vainly waited for the word from us, sitting in his arid office in Berlin, endlessly nosing through newspapers. I said aloud, I must flee. I rose soundlessly, in a useless perfection of silence, as though Madden were already on my trail. Something, perhaps merely the vanity of proving my helplessness, made me look through my pockets. I found what I knew I would find: the American watch, the nickel chain, with the square charm, the key ring, with the useless and compromising keys to Ruenberg's flat, the wallet, a letter which I decided to destroy at once, and did not destroy, a cigar, 2 shillings, and a few coppers, the red and blue pencil, the handkerchief, the revolver with 1 bullet. Absurdly, I weighed it in my hand to give me courage. Vaguely, I thought that a pistol shot could be heard over a long distance. In 10 minutes, my plan was complete. The telephone directory gave me the name of the only individual capable of transmitting my message. He lived in the suburb of Fenton, less than half an hour away by train. I am a cowardly man. Now I can say it. Now that I have carried out a plan, the peril of which none can deny. I know the terror of that plan. I did not know it for Germany. I care nothing for the barbarous country which imposed upon me the humiliation of being a spy. Besides, I know of one Englishman, an unassuming man, who to me ranks no whit below Goth. I talked with him for not over an hour, but during that hour he was Goth. I did this thing because I felt that the chief held in scorn those of my race, the innumerable ancestors who flow together in me. I wished to prove to him that a man with yellow skin could save his armies. Moreover, I wanted to escape Captain Madden. At any moment his hands and his voice would pound against my door. I dressed silently, bade myself farewell in my mirror, and left the house. It was a short distance to the station, but I thought it wiser to take a cab. I argued that I ran less risk of being recognized. Actually, it was because in the deserted street I felt visible and infinitely vulnerable. I remember that I told the driver to stop a little before the main entrance. With difficulty, I forced myself to get out casually, slowly. I was going to the village of Ashgrove, but I bought a ticket for a station farther along the line. The train would leave in a very few minutes at 8:50. I hurried. The next train was not until 9:30. There was almost no one on the platform. I looked over the coaches. I remember a few working men, a woman in mourning, a young man absorbed in the annals of Tacitus, a wounded and happy soldier. At last the train pulled out. A man pursued it vainly to the edge of the platform. I recognized Captain Richard Madden. Shattered, trembling, I sank into the opposite corner of the compartment, away from the terrifying window. I passed from this shattered state to an almost abject contentment. I told myself that the duel had begun, and that I had won the first encounter by thus frustrating, even if for only 40 minutes, even if by a caprice of fate, the attack of my adversary. I argued that this least of victories foreshadowed the total victory. I argued that it was not so small a triumph, since but for this precious difference presented to me by the timetable, I should now be imprisoned or dead. I argued no less sophistically that my cowardly contentment proved me a man capable of carrying out the adventure successfully. From this weakness I drew forces that were not to desert me. I perceive that man will give himself over with each day to more atrocious enterprises. Soon there will be only warriors and bandits. To them I leave this counsel. He who undertakes an atrocious enterprise must imagine that he has already accomplished it, must impose upon himself a future no less irrevocable than the past. That was my course, while my eyes, the eyes of a man already dead, noted the liquidity of that day, which was perhaps the last, and the diffusion of the night. The train ran smoothly through rows of ash trees. It stopped almost in the open country. No one called the name of the station. Ashgrove? I asked some children on the platform. Ashgrove, they replied. I got off. A lamp lit up the platform, but the children's faces remained in the zone of shadow. One boy asked me, "Are you going to Dr. Stephen Colbridge's?" Without waiting for my answer, another said, "The house is a long way off, but you won't get lost if you take the road to the left and turn to the left at every crossroads." Tossed him a coin, my last. I went down a few stone steps and entered the lonely road. Slowly I followed it. It was of unpaved earth. The branches mingled overhead. The low circular moon seemed to accompany me. For one instant I thought that Captain Madden had in some manner realized my desperate intention. I soon understood that that was impossible. The advice always to turn to the left reminded me that such was the standard procedure for reaching the center of certain mazes. I have some knowledge of mazes. Not for nothing am I the descendant of that Tsun, who was governor of Yongsan, but renounced temporal power to write a novel, which was to be yet more all-embracing than the Hong Lu Ming, and to construct a maze in which no man might find his way. 13 years he devoted to these ill-assorted labors, but the hand of a stranger murdered him, and the novel made no sense, and no man found the maze. Beneath English trees I meditated on this lost maze. I imagined it inviolate and perfect, on the secret summit of some mountain. I imagined it erased by rice fields or sunk beneath water. I imagined it infinite, no longer constructed of octagonal kiosks and twisting paths, but of rivers and provinces and kingdoms. I thought of a maze of mazes, a labyrinth of labyrinths, one sinuous waxing labyrinth that should include the past and the future, and in some manner involve the stars. Absorbed in these illusory images, I forgot the fate which pursued me. I felt myself for a certain space of time abstract perceiver of the world. The limpid, living countryside, the moon, the dying body of the evening worked upon me, and the slope of the road eliminated any possibility of weariness. The evening was intimate and infinite. The road descended and forked among the dimmed meadows. A shrill, symbolic music drew near and faded in the shifting wind, swaddled in leaves and distance. I thought that a man may be the enemy of other men, of other moments of other men, but not of a country, not of fireflies, words, gardens, watercourses, sunsets. Thus I arrived before a tall and rusty gate. Through its grill I made out a grove of poplars and a small house. I understand suddenly two things, the first trivial, the second all but incredible. The music came from the house, and the music was Chinese. This was why I had accepted it so fully, and with so little curiosity. I do not recall whether there was a bell or whether I knocked. The music continued to sparkle. But from the depth of the little house a lantern drew near, a lantern which set out its rays to ring the trunks of the poplars, a paper lantern, which had the shape of a drum and the color of the moon. A tall man bore it. I could not see his face. the light blinded me. He opened the gate and said slowly in my own language, "I observe that the pious High Sping has undertaken to correct my solitude. You wish no doubt to see the garden?" I recognized the name of one of our consuls. Disconcerted, I repeated, "The garden?" "The garden of the forking paths." Something stirred in my memory. With unaccountable certainty, I said, "The garden of my ancestor, Tsui Pen?" "Your ancestor? Your illustrious ancestor? Come in." The damp path zigzagged like those I knew in childhood. We entered a library of Eastern and Western books. I recognized, bound in yellow silk, certain manuscript volumes of that lost encyclopedia, edited by the Third Empire of the Luminous Dynasty, but never printed. The gramophone record revolved near a bronze phoenix. I remembered, too, a porcelain jar of the Rose family, and another, many centuries older, of that blue which our craftsmen copied from the Persian potters. Stephen Corby was watching me with a smile. He was, as I said, very tall, sharp-featured, gray-eyed, gray-bearded. There was something of a priest about him, and also something of a sailor. Later he told me that he had been a missionary in Tianjin before I sought to become a sinologue. We seated ourselves, I on a long, low divan, he with his back to the window and to the tall, round clock. I calculated that I had an hour before the arrival of my pursuer, Captain Madden. My irrevocable resolve could wait. "The fate of your ancestor, Tsui Pen," said Stephen Corby, "was astonishing. He was governor of his native province, learned in astronomy and astrology, and the unwearying exegesis of the canonical books, a master of chess, a famous poet and calligrapher. And all this he abandoned to compose a book and a maze. He renounced the pleasures alike of tyranny and of justice, of his well-populated couch, of banquets, and even of learning. And for 13 years he shut himself up in the pavilion of limpid solitude. On his death, his heirs found nothing save chaotic manuscripts. His family, as you are perhaps aware, wished to have these burned, but his executor, a Taoist or Buddhist monk, insisted on their publication. "We are the race of Tsui Pen," I replied. "Continue to curse that monk. The publication was an absurd enterprise. The book is a shapeless accumulation of contradictory drafts. I've examined it somewhat. In Chapter 3, the hero dies. In Chapter 4, he is alive. As for Tsui Pen's other undertaking, the maze." "Here is the maze," he said, indicating a tall lacquered desk. "A marble maze," I exclaimed. "A labyrinth in miniature." "A labyrinth of symbols," he corrected me. "An invisible labyrinth in time. It has fallen to my lot, English barbarian that I am, to unveil this diaphanous mystery. After more than 100 years, the details are lost irrevocably, but one may conjecture the course of events. Upon the occasion, Tsui Pen announced, "I am retiring to write a book." Upon another, "I am retiring to construct a maze." Everyone thought of two undertakings. No one imagined that the book and the maze were one. The pavilion of limpid solitude stood, let us say, in the center of a rather intricate garden. This fact may have suggested a physical labyrinth. Tsui Pen died. In all the widespread lands that were his, no man could find the maze. The chaos of the novel suggested to me that the book itself was the maze. Two circumstances gave me the correct solution to the problem. One, the curious legend that Tsun had proposed to construct a labyrinth strictly infinite in its extension. The other, a fragment of a letter upon which I chanced. Corby rose. For a moment he turned his back to me and opened a drawer in the desk of black and gold lacquer. He returned with a sheet of once crimson paper. Now it was pink and fragile and creased. Tsun had been justly celebrated for his calligraphy. With excitement without comprehension, I read the words which the man of my blood had traced with his minute brush. I leave to the various futures, and not to all, my garden of forking paths. Wordlessly I returned the paper. Corby continued. Before I unearthed this letter, I had constantly asked myself how a book could be infinite. I could imagine no other method than that of a cyclic, a circular volume, a volume whose last page should be identical with the first, thus possibly continuing indefinitely. I remembered, too, that night which stands in the center of the 1001 Nights, when Queen Scheherazade, by some magical aberration of the copyist, begins to relate word for word the story of the 1001 Nights, incurring the danger of arriving once more at the night in which she tells the story of the nights, and thus continue to infinity. I conceived also an hereditary work, transmitted from father to son, to which each new generation should add a chapter or correct with pious care the pages of the ancients. These conjectures served to entertain me, but none of them seemed to correspond, even remotely, to the contradictory chapters of the Tsun. In this perplexity I received from Oxford the letter which you have examined. I paused naturally at the phrase, "I leave to various futures," and not to all, my garden of forking paths. Almost instantly I understood. The garden of forking paths was the chaotic novel. The phrase, "the various futures," and not all, suggested to my mind a forking, a bifurcation, not in space, but in time. Another survey of the work confirmed this theory. In all other works of fiction, a character confronted with various alternatives chooses one and eliminates the others. In this novel, the character chooses simultaneously all of them. He thus creates varying futures, varying times, which in their turn likewise proliferate and fork. From this arise the contradictions of the novel. Fang, let us say, has a secret. An unknown man raps at the door. Fang resolves to kill him. Naturally, this situation may resolve itself in several possible manners. Fang may kill the intruder may kill Fang. Both may survive. Both may perish, and so on. In the work of Tsun, all these resolutions occur. Each one is the point of departure for future forkings. Upon occasions, the paths of this maze converge. For example, you arrive at my home, but in one of the possible paths, you are my friend, in another, my enemy. If you will tolerate my incurable accent, we shall read a few pages. In the vivid circle of lamplight, his face was unquestionably that of an old man, but there was something unbreakable about it, even immortal. He read with slow precision two versions of the same epic chapter. In the first, an army marches toward the battle across a barren mountain. The horror of the rocks and shadows causes them to hold their lives cheap, and they gain an easy victory. In the second, the same army passes through a palace where a festival is in progress. The glittering battle seems to them continuation of the festival, and they gain an easy victory. With seemly veneration I listen to these ancient narratives, perhaps less admirable in themselves than because my blood had conceived them, and because a man of a remote empire had restored them to me in the course of a desperate adventure in a western isle. I remember the last words, repeated in each version, like a hidden commandment. Thus did the heroes fight, peace in their noble hearts, and violence in their swords, resolved to kill and to die. From that moment on I felt about me and within me an invisible, intangible swarming, not the swarming of the divergent, parallel, ultimately coalescing armies, but an agitation at once more inaccessible and more intimate, which the armies in some manner prefigured. Stephen Corby continued, I do not believe that your illustrious ancestor was playing an idle game with his variations. I do not find it plausible that he should sacrifice 13 years in the infinite execution of a rhetorical experiment. In your country, the novel is a subsidiary form of literature. In his time, it was even a contemptible one. Sui Pen was a novelist of genius, but he was also a man of letters who assuredly did not consider himself a mere novelist. The evidence of his contemporaries demonstrates, and his own life confirms, his leanings toward the metaphysical, the mystical. Philosophical debate usurps a large portion of the novel. From other sources I know that of all problems none so perturbed and beset him as the abysmal problem of time. And yet that is the only problem which does not figure in the pages of The Garden. Not once does he employ even the very character which means time. How do you account for this deliberate omission? I advanced various solutions, none of them satisfactory. We discussed them, and at last Stephen Corby said, In a riddle the answer to which is chess. What is the one forbidden word? I reflected a moment and answered, The word chess. Precisely, said Corby. The Garden of Forking Paths is a vast riddle, or parable, whose meaning is time. That recondite cause forbids the mention of the word. Always to omit a word, to seek refuge in inept metaphors or blatant paraphrases, is perhaps the most emphatic method of stressing that word. It is a tortuous method preferred in each meandering of his indefatigable novel by the oblique Sui Pen. I have collated hundreds of manuscripts. I have corrected the errors introduced by the carelessness of copyists. I have conjured the plan of this chaos. I have reestablished, I believe, the primordial order. I have translated the entire work, constantly struck by the fact that the translations never once necessitated the use of the word time. The explanation is obvious. The Gardens of Forking Paths is an image, incomplete, but not inaccurate, of the universe as Tai Pen conceived it. Your ancestor differed from Newton and Schopenhauer in not believing in one uniform and absolute time. He believed an infinite series of time, in a waxing, dizzying web of times, divergent, convergent, and parallel. This network of times which draw near each other, fork out of each other, cut across each other, or know nothing of each other for centuries. These times embrace all possibilities. In most of these times we do not exist. In some, you exist, and I do not. In others, I, but not you. In yet others, both of us. In this time, a favorable fate has granted that you enter my house. In another, you found me dead as you crossed the garden. In another, I am saying these very words, but I am an illusion, a phantom. In all times, I pronounced, not without a tremor, I offer you my gratitude and veneration for your remaking of the garden of sweet pen. Not in all, he murmured, smiling. Time forks forever toward innumerable futures. In one of them I am your enemy. Once more I felt that swarming of which I spoke. It seemed to me that the moist garden outside the house was infinitely saturated with invisible personages, and all of them were Corby and I, bound to other secrets, laden with other tasks, shaped in other forms or other dimensions of time. I raised my eyes. The tenuous nightmare dissolved. In the yellow and black garden there was only one man, but that man was strong as a statue. That man was coming toward me, down the path, and he was Captain Richard Madden. The future exists already, I said, but I am your friend. May I look at the letter again? Corby rose. The tall old man opened the drawer of the tall desk. For a moment he turned his back on me. I had the revolver ready. I fired with the utmost care. Corby fell immediately without a word. I swear that his death was instantaneous, a lightning stroke. The rest is unreal and insignificant. Captain Madden burst in and arrested me. I have been sentenced to hang, and I have won admirably. I have communicated to Berlin the secret name of the city which they must attack. They bombed it yesterday. I read that in the very papers which presented the English people with the puzzle of why the learned sinologue Stephen Corby should have been murdered by a stranger, Tsun. The chief has deciphered this puzzle. He knows that my problem was how to indicate, across the uproar of the war, the city called Corby, and that I found no other solution save to murder a man of that name. He does not know. No one can know. My unspeakable regret and weariness. This has been The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges, translated by Anthony Buckner, narrated by Mike Vendetti. Production copyright 2024 by Mike Vendetti Productions. www.mikevendetti.com